It's a very interesting topic, this one, and one that in some ways through the memoir I think paint the picture of the type of leadership that I think is important. But for today's 20 minutes or so, what I thought I'd talk about is, starting with the topic, is leadership is not what it used to be. And I think it's a subject when many of us think about, I can't quite see how old you are, but if you think, sorry. Oh, right, young. Oh, good. This doesn't quite make the point. I suppose, I often think about leadership when I first joined the police and perhaps even a little before that. My father, who I write about in the book, came from the Second World War. And I suppose within him and then many other people, what I watched was a kind of model of leadership. He was a police officer, had been in the Navy during the Second World War, and he, like many, many thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of men, came back from that war and came back into different sorts of roles. And I think that what has underpinned the model, along with obviously a lot of academic reading, is this issue around the kind of model of leadership that those people had seen during the Second World War. And I suppose you describe it in lots of different sorts of ways, but it certainly became pervasive in management, in big organisations, in big industrial organisations, and that sense of leadership was, and still is, I think, in some ways described as kind of a top-down, do as I tell you to do, the sort of bosses and the troops, the kind of captains of ships who always knew where to go and knew what to do. And that sense of the style of management actually, I think, pervaded much of what we've seen, and in some cases nowadays I think still see. But I would argue that that style of leadership was necessary to change, and it was necessary for many, many kind of reasons. And I think what I saw when I came into the police was very much a kind of a seniority model. The very senior people were kind of somewhere up there, and the rest of us were very much on the ground, doing pretty much what they told us to do. And the idea that you didn't really need to think, the idea that you would follow the rules and procedures, and they were very important rules and procedures. But my argument is that lots of things changed in policing. In the book I talk about that. But I also think in terms of the community itself. And so people like me joining the police in the 70s, but also at that stage many, many other groups of people, I think, decided that the way the world had been after the Second World War should change, and issues around education became important. I got an education for $232 for a degree, because Gough Whitlam decided that people could go to universities. And also in terms of communications, the kind of dramatic sorts of changes we saw from the 70s until these days, technology, a whole range of things. I remember giving a lecture once, not all that long ago, and I remember someone had said to me, the internet will never take off, it's for nerds. And they were wrong about so many things. And I think the other part was about diversity. It was about people exercising their rights. It was around all of that change that we've seen. And I think what I saw along the way was people starting to see leadership a little differently. That perhaps it wasn't just a male type of behaviour, that it could in fact be a type of behaviour from a whole, sort of from the females as well as males, but from a lot of different people within our communities. There are still people, I believe, though, who hunker, I think that's the term, for the old ways, for that kind of model of leadership that people in some cases felt secure with, but it was a model of leadership that was a principally male model of leadership, and not all a range of males, just a particular group. And so when you think about the leadership research that's around these days, and there are some very good writers within this country and others that I've studied with at Harvard University, a guy called Ron Heifetz, who is probably one of the world leaders in thinking about different sorts of leaderships and leadership styles. But one of the pieces of research I quite like a lot, and I've been using recently when I've been teaching leadership courses, was to kind of a phased leadership, which talks about the sort of early days for most of us, the sort of behaviours, perhaps not quite leading, but sort of starting to get there. You sort of show behaviours that are about sort of being part of a group, that it's sort of face-saving, that you sort of go along to get along, that you don't really want to stand out. And if you think about young people in some cases, that sort of behaviour is part of it, and probably even some older people who don't want to really take on any more, happy to be what they are. And there's nothing, I'm not being critical of it, but it is a kind of a phase. And then some of us start to find our own agenda. We start to kind of move into what they call the second phase of this leadership issue. And it's got various sorts of issues. You start to sort of find a problem that you want to actually work on, or something that you think's important, and realise that maybe things have to change if you want to follow that kind of a process. And one of the ways they described it is you learn to lead. And so you experiment a bit and you kind of test out your own experience. And so I guess the sort of second phase. And the third phase they describe as the leading to learn. And so it's a kind of an interesting way of describing it, but in this case you do have an agenda. You do start to drive forward with really quite significant issues you want to see done. You also know how to sort out the wheat from the chaff, that you know the different options, that you know to get done what you need to get done, you have to trust people. And that sort of a model of leadership is why I hadn't kind of quite seen it described. It also is one that you might describe as a shared leadership model. It's a model that says that none of us actually ever did do this alone. We might have characterised it that way, but in fact we never did. And so the kind of ways I'd like to talk about this, maybe consensus leadership, and using my own self as an example, when I went into Victoria Police, I remember when I went for the job, and as I said, I described this in the book, I talked to, I was the final interview with Steve Bracks, and he said to me, Christine, what does a great police organisation look like? I said, well, I could tell you what it would look like. It would, it had certain sorts of characteristics, it would do certain things. And he said to me, well, that's okay, but, tell me. And I said, well, look, there really is no point, because it isn't about what I want. It would be about what the community wants us to do. It would be about what you want us to do. It would be about what the members of the organisation want. It would be about what the evidence and research says. And that would underpin the way that we would go forward. And at that point he had quite a big book and he slammed the book. I thought, well, I've stuffed that up. And I remember going outside and my very kind husband, I said, well, I've stuffed it. And I should have given, the vision speech and all of that. And he said, well, if they don't want you, they don't deserve you, which I thought was very nice of him. And anyway, as it turned out, a couple of days later, I was rung and said that I'd actually got the job. But that model of leadership is one that I think that is the model that people are starting to see. There is really quite good evidence around the idea that working with people, not being apart from them, not suggesting you're any better than them. And there's a great line I use from Drucker, who's a wonderful old management writer, and he said, leadership is not about money, it's not about power, it's not about position, it's not about privilege, and it's not about rank. It is about responsibility. And that sense, if you see leadership in that regard, then that's a somewhat different model, I think, from the way many people would see it. So the police, that's the model we went through, working with communities, working with the government to understand what that was about. A big team of people in the senior leadership team. But I remember one of the things I used to go out and say to the members until the very finish is, I'm no better than you are. I know some things, I get paid more than you, and I know what you all get paid. But the fact is we can all make a difference, and if we all are leaders, then we can do much better. So that was the model that really underpinned the time I was in the police. Not always necessarily understood. People said, well, what about sort of hierarchies? What about, spans of control? And I said, well, what about it? It's really around getting people to drive towards achieving the goals that we were very clearly had set. It's a great piece of research that Telstra did once. So what people want from their leaders is they actually want to know that someone knows where the organisation is going. That the second part is that they want to know, what do you want me to do? What's my bit? And the third bit is they want to be supported in the job that they're doing. And the fourth bit, which Telstra didn't publish, is they don't want bullshit. And I think, that's the kind of model that we follow. When I went to the Bushfire Authority, in the experience that I'd had with Victoria Police and I guess my whole career really, I went to the Bushfire Authority with the same basis of leadership. The idea that we would work with communities, that there was strength even though communities had been extraordinarily damaged. There were 109 communities touched by those fires. And what we did very quickly was tried to understand what it was that those communities wanted us to do. And we then formed 33 community recovery groups, which were made up of citizens who never in their wildest dreams, in the main, would have imagined that they would stand up as leaders of their communities. And just one short piece, because I know it's a very tight time frame, this one, was really an issue around a couple of people that were part of that. I can't find it, but it really talks about a teacher. Her name was Ange, who she had lost her home in the fires, but she decided that she would use her skills to help her community. And then there was a nun called Chiguan from King Lake who stood up and stood up for her community, and so many other people who were part of it. And I watched those people in a shared leadership model. They figured out what they were trying to do. They brought along their own communities. They communicated along the way. And it didn't matter whether they were men or women. They showed their strengths and skills, and in some cases are still doing that. I think what we've also seen in a bit broader context lately is a Prime Minister. And I wanted to talk about the Prime Minister. I didn't see the ABC show last night. I did hear the reviews, and I did hear that Julia came out of it okay. But I think the Prime Minister is someone that has caused many people in our community to start to kind of look at these leadership models. And I think she's being judged on the old models. She is dealing with an incredibly complex system where she is in a minority government, having to make sure that a whole range of other people are part of it. Not only her party, but a whole sort of set of interests in the community. And my sense of the way she's trying to go about that is a really shared leadership model. That doesn't mean that when a decision is taken you don't drive forward for it. Never said that. But what it is about a complexity of leadership. And what I watch, I think with her and perhaps others as well, and perhaps even me on occasions, is this voice of ridicule that sometimes undermines us as our community and undermines people like her. The ridicule about your voice, about what you wear, about your hair, about whether you have a partner or not, and sometimes about your size. And they're just some of the things. And that ridicule is all about fear. And I do talk about that quite extensively in the book, around making people afraid, about ridiculing people who might stand up and say, maybe that isn't the way to do things. And so I watched Julia, and I think we need to think about the kind of complexity that she's dealing with as Prime Minister. And the other week I was talking to some Pacific Island people, and I talked about President Obama. And one of them said to me, Christine, I don't think people get it, that he too is a consensus leader, that he is of the Pacific Islands and is part of, that's his culture and that's what he reflects. What people want him to be, particularly in some cases those who control the media, is something else other than what he is. And so it seems to me, when you think about that kind of model of leadership, that we have moved forward as a community, but there will always be people who want to go back to the kind of command and control, to the top-down kind of model. And even on occasions they'll say to me, well, that's what defence does. That's what the generals and the troops do. That's not what happens anymore. That's a misreading of the way the military actually operates. And I've listened to some very senior major generals and work with them who very much say that is not even the way the defence works anymore. Nor is it the way that major corporations work, nor is it the way that I think our community should work. So I hope that that idea of leadership is not what it used to be. Thank God. Finished.